The studio was electric, humming with the kind of anticipation that only comes before a moment destined to be replayed for years. The lights were set, the cameras rolling, and the audience, both in the room and across the country, waited for what was supposed to be a routine political interview. But as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett took her seat across from Rachel Maddow, the air seemed to thicken, as if everyone present could sense that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Maddow, the undisputed queen of progressive television, had built her reputation on her sharp intellect and her ability to hold even the most seasoned politicians to account. She was the gatekeeper, the final word, the person who could make or break a political career with a single question. But tonight, the script was about to be flipped. Congresswoman Crockett, your recent comments about the direction of the progressive movement have sparked quite a bit of controversy. Maddow began, her voice calm but edged with that familiar tone of intellectual challenge. She leaned forward, her glasses catching the light, her posture radiating confidence. For years, politicians had come to this studio, hoping to survive Maddow's grilling and maybe, just maybe, earn her approval. But Jasmine Crockett was not just another politician. She was a force of nature, forged in the fires of real-world struggle, and she had come prepared for more than just a polite exchange of talking points. As Maddow finished her question, the room seemed to hold its breath. Crockett's expression was composed, almost serene, but her eyes flashed with a quiet intensity. Rachel, with all due respect, you've spent years talking about progressive values from the comfort of this studio. I've been living them in the real world. Maybe it's time you stepped outside your bubble and actually listened to the people you claim to represent. The words landed like a thunderclap. For a split second, Maddow's trademark smirk faltered, replaced by a look of genuine surprise. The camera zoomed in, capturing every nuance of her reaction, the widening eyes, the slight parting of her lips, the unmistakable realization that she had just been challenged in a way she hadn't anticipated. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary confrontation, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next, because this isn't just another political interview. This is the moment when a rising star in American politics decided to take on one of the most powerful voices in the media and the entire country. Was about to witness the fallout. To truly understand why this moment was so explosive, you need to know who these two women are and what they represent in the broader landscape of American politics. Rachel Maddow is more than just a television host. She's a brand, a symbol of the educated liberal elite, the person millions of progressives turn to for guidance, analysis, and validation. With her Oxford PhD and her razor-sharp wit, she's built an empire on dissecting the news, exposing corruption, and holding the powerful to account. But there's another side to Maddow's success, a side that's rarely discussed. Her rise has been fueled by a kind of intellectual arrogance, a belief that she knows what's best for the progressive movement, even if it means talking over the very people she claims to champion. Enter Jasmine Crockett, the 42-year-old congresswoman from Texas who embodies everything Maddow talks about but has never actually been. Born and raised in St. Louis, Crockett worked her way through law school while supporting her family. She spent years as a civil rights attorney, fighting real battles in real courtrooms for people who couldn't afford fancy lawyers or media attention. When she ran for Congress, she didn't have the backing of wealthy donors or the blessing of media elites. She had something more powerful, an authentic connection to the communities she promised to serve. Crockett's journey hasn't been easy. As a black woman in politics, she's faced obstacles that Maddow, for all her progressive rhetoric, has never had to navigate. She's been dismissed, underestimated, and patronized by the very people who claim to be her allies. But instead of backing down, she's used every slight as fuel for her fire. Tonight, that fire was burning brighter than ever. The tension between these two women is more than personal. It's a microcosm of a much larger battle within progressive politics, a battle between the established media elite who speak for progressives, from positions of comfort and privilege, and the emerging leaders who live the struggles they fight against. On one side, you have Maddow, the voice of the liberal establishment, delivering carefully crafted monologues to an audience that hangs on her every word. On the other, you have Crockett, who refuses to be told what her priorities should be by people who've never walked in her shoes. As the interview continued, Maddow tried to regain control. Congresswoman Crockett, you've been critical of some traditional progressive approaches to criminal justice reform. Some would say your positions align more with moderate Democrats than with the progressive movement that helped elect you. It was a classic Maddow move, frame the question in a way that puts the guest on the defensive, forcing them to justify their credentials. But Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in, her voice calm but unyielding. Rachel, can you tell me the last time you actually spoke to someone whose family was affected by violent crime in an underserved community? The question caught Maddow off guard. She stammered, "Well, I've covered many stories about criminal justice, that's not what I asked." Crockett interrupted, her tone sharpening. "I asked when you last spoke to someone who actually lives with the consequences of the policies you advocate for on television every night." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the usual dynamic, where Maddow controlled the conversation through her superior knowledge and preparation. Crockett was flipping the script, and Maddow was visibly struggling to keep up. Maddow's composure, so often her armor, began to crack. She tried to pivot, to reassert her authority. "I think my record of advocacy speaks for itself," she replied, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Crockett didn't miss a beat. "Your record of advocacy. Rachel, you make $30 million a year talking about issues you've never personally experienced. I spent a decade as a civil rights attorney, working with families who couldn't afford to pay their rent, let alone hire a lawyer. I've sat in courtrooms where the decisions actually matter, not just in studios where everything is theoretical." The tension in the room was palpable. Off-camera, Maddow's producer could be seen gesturing frantically, trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected turn. This wasn't the script. Progressive politicians were supposed to come on the show, receive Maddow's blessing, and leave with their reputations intact. But Crockett wasn't playing by those rules. She was here to challenge the very foundation of Maddow's authority. "I think you're mischaracterizing my work," Maddow said, her tone defensive. "I've been holding the powerful accountable for years, exposing corruption and fighting for progressive values when it wasn't popular to do so." Crockett's smile grew wider, but it wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, fighting for progressive values when it wasn't popular. "Rachel, you've built your entire career on telling liberal audiences exactly what they want to hear. When's the last time you challenged your viewers' assumptions about anything? When's the last time you told them something that might make them uncomfortable?" The question hung in the air like a live wire. Maddow's face flushed, her grip on her notes tightening. She was used to being the one asking the uncomfortable questions, not answering them. "I think we're getting off track here," Maddow said, attempting to redirect the conversation. "The real issue is whether your positions on criminal justice reform serve the communities you represent." But Crockett wasn't about to let her off the hook. "No, Rachel, I think we're exactly on track, because this is the problem with progressive media right now. You've created this bubble where wealthy journalists get to decide what's best for working-class communities without ever actually listening to what those communities want." The camera zoomed in on Maddow's face, capturing every micro-expression as she realized she was losing control of her own show. Her usual intellectual confidence was cracking under the pressure of Crockett's relentless authenticity. "You want to talk about my positions on criminal justice?" Crockett continued, her voice gaining momentum. "Let me tell you about the grandmother in my district who's afraid to leave her house after dark because of gang violence. Let me tell you about the small business owner who's been robbed 3 times this year. These aren't theoretical problems, Rachel. These are real people living with real consequences while you sit in your studio and theorize about what justice should look like." Maddow tried another redirect, but her voice was shaking now. "I'm not diminishing the experiences of your constituents. But surely you can see that some of my positions, what?" Crockett interrupted, her tone sharper than ever, "don't align with what you think they should be. Rachel, I'm not here to get your approval for how I represent my district. I'm here because you invited me on your show, presumably to have a conversation. But it seems like you're more interested in lecturing me about what my positions should be than actually listening to why I hold them." The studio was dead silent, except for the hum of the cameras. Maddow's carefully constructed persona was beginning to crumble under the weight of Crockett's challenge. This was unprecedented territory for the veteran host, who was used to guests deferring to her intellectual authority. "I think there might be some miscommunication here," Maddow said weakly, clearly searching for a way to regain control of the situation. But Crockett was just getting started. "The only miscommunication here, Rachel, is that you seem to think your platform gives you the right to determine what authentic progressive leadership looks like. But here's the thing, I don't need your validation to represent my constituents effectively." The escalation was complete. What had started as a routine political interview had become a full-scale confrontation between two very different visions of progressive politics, and Maddow was clearly unprepared for the intensity of Crockett's challenge. The moment of truth was approaching, and you could feel the electricity in the studio. As both women prepared for what would become the defining exchange of the interview, Maddow, desperate to regain her authority, made one final attempt to reassert control over the narrative. "Congresswoman, I think you're being somewhat unfair," Maddow said, her voice strained but trying to maintain that familiar tone of intellectual superiority. "My show has consistently advocated for the very communities you represent. We've covered police brutality, economic inequality, racial injustice, all issues that affect your constituents directly." It was a classic deflection, an attempt to shift the focus from Maddow's personal privilege to her show's content. But Crockett had been waiting for exactly this moment, and her response would become the stuff of political television legend. Crockett paused for just a beat, letting Maddow's words hang in the air. Then, with the precision of a surgeon and the force of a sledgehammer, she delivered the line that would be replayed millions of times across social media. "Rachel, You've been covering these issues the same way a food critic covers restaurants. You can describe the meal perfectly, but you've never had to worry about where your next one is coming from. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Maddow's mouth literally fell open, her composure completely shattered. The camera captured every second of her stunned reaction as she processed what had just happened. This wasn't just a clever comeback, it was a complete dismantling of her entire professional persona. But Crockett wasn't finished. Having landed the devastating blow, she pressed her advantage with surgical precision. You want to know the difference between us, Rachel? When I talk about criminal justice reform, I'm thinking about the kid I represented, whose mother was killed in a drive-by shooting while she was waiting for the bus to work her second job. When you talk about it, you're thinking about how it fits into your narrative about systemic oppression. Both perspectives matter, but only one of us has had to look that kid in the eye and explain why the system failed his family. Maddow was visibly struggling now, her face flushed and her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her notes. She tried to interject, but Crockett's momentum was unstoppable. And here's what really bothers me about this whole conversation, Crockett continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You invited me on your show not to learn from my experience or to hear different perspectives from within the progressive movement. You invited me on to scold me for not being progressive enough by your standards, but your standards are set from a position of privilege that most of the people we claim to represent will never experience. The camera operators were clearly struggling to know where to focus. Maddow's face showed complete shock and growing anger, while Crockett remained calm but intense, delivering her points with the precision of someone who had clearly thought deeply about these issues. I've spent my entire career fighting for working families, for people of color, for anyone who's been left behind by our system, Crockett said, her voice rising slightly. I've done it in courtrooms where the stakes were real, in communities where the consequences mattered, and now in Congress where I have to build actual coalitions to pass actual legislation. You've done it from a television studio where the biggest risk is losing viewers. Maddow finally found her voice, but it was weak and defensive. I think you're being incredibly unfair to the work that journalists do. Am I? Crockett interrupted, and now there was fire in her eyes. Let me ask you something, Rachel. How many times have you changed your mind about a political position based on something you learned from someone who actually lives with the consequences of that policy? The question hung in the air like a challenge that Maddow clearly couldn't answer. Her silence spoke volumes. Behind the cameras, production assistants exchanged glances, recognizing that their host was in completely uncharted territory. This wasn't the kind of interview they had prepared for, and there was no script or talking points that could help Maddow navigate this level of authentic challenge. But what made Crockett's approach so devastating was that she wasn't attacking Maddow personally, she was systematically dismantling the entire framework of elite progressive discourse. She was exposing how conversations about policy and values had become divorced from the actual experiences of the people those policies were supposed to help. This wasn't just about two women disagreeing on television. This was about fundamental questions of representation and authenticity that went to the heart of progressive politics. Who gets to speak for working families? Who gets to define what justice looks like and what happens when the people doing the speaking have never actually lived the experiences they're discussing? Because I change my mind all the time, Crockett continued. I listen to my constituents. I learn from their experiences and I adjust my positions accordingly. That's what representation actually means. But you seem to think that progressive politics is about intellectual purity rather than practical results for real people. The studio audience was completely silent, mesmerized by this unprecedented dismantling of one of liberal media's biggest stars. Maddow's carefully constructed image was crumbling in real time and everyone could see it happening. If you know what the real tragedy is here, Crockett said, and now her voice carried a note of genuine sadness mixed with frustration. We should be allies? We should be working together to advance progressive causes. But instead, you've created this dynamic where you get to sit in judgment of elected officials like me, determining whether we're pure enough for your approval. That's not journalism, Rachel. That's gatekeeping. Maddow made one last, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. I've never claimed to be anything other than a journalist trying to hold politicians accountable. Accountable to who? Crockett shot back immediately. To your audience, to your advertisers, or to the people whose lives are actually affected by the policies we're debating. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're more concerned with maintaining your brand as the smart progressive than you are with actually advancing progressive causes. The knockout blow had been delivered, and everyone in the studio knew it. Maddow sat there, her intellectual confidence completely shattered, unable to formulate a coherent response to Crockett's devastating critique. But Crockett wasn't done yet. She had one final point to make, and it would be the one that social media would quote endlessly in the hours to come. Here's the bottom line. Rachel, you can keep talking about progressive values from your comfortable studio, collecting your massive paycheck, and pretending that you understand the struggles of working families. But until you're willing to step outside your bubble and actually listen to the people you claim to represent, you're just another wealthy pundit. Cosplaying as a progressive champion. The word cosplaying hit like a thunderbolt. It was the perfect encapsulation of Crockett's entire critique, that Maddow was essentially playing dress-up as a progressive while living a life of extreme privilege. Disconnected from the communities she claimed to champion, Maddow's face went completely white. For the first time in her career, the master of political television had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered by her guest. The student had become the teacher, and the lesson was being broadcast live to millions of viewers. The immediate aftermath of Crockett's verbal destruction of Maddow was unlike anything political television had seen in years. As soon as the interview ended, social media exploded with reactions, memes, and analysis of what had just transpired. Within minutes, Crockett destroys Maddow was trending nationwide on Twitter, with the cosplaying comment being shared tens of thousands of times. The video clip of Crockett's food critic analogy racked up over 1 million views in the first hour alone, with users across the political spectrum praising her for speaking truth to power in a way they'd never seen before. But the reactions weren't just coming from social media users. Political commentators, journalists, and elected officials were all weighing in on what was being called the most brutal takedown in recent television history. The response from political journalists was particularly telling. Many who had built their careers on similar dynamics, using their platforms to lecture politicians rather than engage with them, found themselves suddenly defensive about their own approaches. Op-ed pieces began appearing in major publications, questioning whether political media had become too disconnected from the communities it claimed to serve. Several veteran journalists privately admitted that Crockett's critique had forced them to examine their own assumptions about their role in political discourse. One longtime political reporter, speaking on condition of anonymity, confessed that watching the interview had been deeply uncomfortable because it highlighted how rarely she actually spoke to regular voters versus political insiders. The academic world also took notice of the confrontation. Political science professors began assigning the interview as a case study in authentic versus performative progressivism. Media studies courses added it to their curricula as an example of how traditional power dynamics in political interviews could be disrupted when guests refused to accept the premise of the interviewer's authority. Think tanks and policy organizations that had long relied on media validation for their progressive credentials found themselves questioned by their own staffers. Young researchers and analysts who had watched the interview began pushing their organizations to engage more directly with affected communities rather than simply crafting policy recommendations from conference rooms. Conservative commentators were having a field day, with many pointing out that it took a progressive Democrat to finally expose what they'd been saying about liberal media for years. Jasmine Crockett just said what we've all been thinking, tweeted one prominent conservative voice. These media elites have no idea what real people actually care about. But perhaps more surprising were the reactions from progressive circles. Many longtime liberals were praising Crockett for challenging what they saw as the ivory tower mentality that had infected progressive media. Finally, someone with the courage to call out the gatekeepers, wrote a popular progressive podcast host. Maddow got exactly what she deserved. The video clips were being dissected frame by frame, with viewers marveling at Maddow's visible shock and Crockett's composed demolition of her arguments. Memes flooded social media, featuring Maddow's stunned expression with captions like, "When you realize you're not the smartest person in the room." In that moment, when authentic experience meets theoretical knowledge, political analysts were quick to point out the broader implications of the confrontation. This wasn't just about two individual women. It represented a fundamental shift happening within progressive politics. The old guard of liberal media elites was being challenged by a new generation of leaders who weren't content to simply receive approval from the establishment. Several prominent Democratic politicians quietly reached out to Crockett's office to express their support, though most were careful not to publicly criticize Maddow given her influence within progressive media circles. But privately, many admitted they'd grown tired of what they saw as Maddow's tendency to lecture rather than listen. The interview also sparked serious conversations about privilege within progressive circles. Many pointed out that critique wasn't just about Maddow personally, but about a broader problem where wealthy, educated liberals often speak for working-class communities without actually engaging with them meaningfully. Media critics were divided on the confrontation. Some defended Maddow, arguing that Crockett had been unnecessarily aggressive and that journalists have every right to challenge politicians, regardless of their background. But others saw it as a long overdue reckoning with the insularity of liberal media. What Crockett did last night was expose the fundamental disconnect between progressive media and progressive politics, wrote one media critic. Maddow has built her career on being the smartest person in the room, but she's never had to deal with someone who has both the intellectual capacity to match her and the real-world experience to back it up. The ratings for the interview were massive, with viewership numbers that dwarfed Maddow's usual audience. But more importantly, the conversation had shifted the entire dynamic of how progressive politicians engage with friendly media. No longer could hosts like Maddow assume that Democratic guests would simply defer to their authority. Within days, other progressive politicians were taking note of Crockett's approach. Several began pushing back more forcefully against what they saw as condescending treatment from liberal media hosts. The era of deferential interviews with friendly journalists was clearly coming to an end. Maddow herself was notably absent from social media in the days following the interview, and her subsequent shows seemed more subdued than usual. MSNBC insiders reported that she was deeply shaken by the confrontation and was reconsidering her approach to interviewing progressive politicians. Sources close to her production team revealed that she had spent hours in private meetings with her producers, trying to understand how the interview had gone so wrong from her perspective. The network's response was telling in its hesitation. Executives who were used to defending their star hosts found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to explain why their most prominent progressive voice had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by a guest. Internal ratings showed that, while the interview had drawn massive viewership, the audience reaction was overwhelmingly in favor of Crockett rather than their own host. This created a unique problem for the network's brand identity. For years, they had positioned themselves as the authentic voice of progressive politics, with hosts who could skillfully challenge conservative politicians while supporting liberal causes. But now, one of their biggest stars had been exposed as out of touch with the very communities they claimed to represent. For Crockett, the aftermath was overwhelmingly positive. Her congressional office was flooded with messages of support from constituents and progressives around the country who felt she had given voice to their frustrations with elite liberal media. Fundraising requests poured in from progressive organizations, who saw her as a rising star who could bridge the gap between grassroots activism and electoral politics. Political strategists were already speculating about Crockett's future prospects. Many saw the Maddow confrontation as a star-making moment that could propel her into national leadership within the Democratic Party. Her ability to articulate progressive values while challenging progressive orthodoxy made her an attractive figure for a party trying to rebuild its coalition. The timing of Crockett's breakthrough couldn't have been more significant. The Democratic Party was facing a crisis of credibility with working-class voters who felt increasingly alienated by what they perceived as elite condescension. Focus groups consistently showed that voters appreciated politicians who spoke to them directly rather than through the filter of media interpreters. Crockett's confrontation with Maddow had demonstrated something that political consultants had been trying to explain for years. Authenticity trumps credentials every time. Voters didn't need another politician who could impress television hosts with their policy knowledge. They needed representatives who understood their struggles because they'd lived them. Personally, this insight was already beginning to influence how other progressive politicians approached media appearances. Several Congress members quietly reached out to Crockett's team to ask for advice on how to handle hostile or condescending interviews. Her approach, turning the tables and making the interviewer defend their own assumptions, was being studied and copied across progressive political circles. The confrontation also highlighted the growing influence of social media on political discourse. Unlike previous generations of politicians who relied heavily on traditional media for exposure, Crockett had built much of her platform through direct communication with constituents. She understood how moments like this would play across different platforms and how to craft messages that would resonate with audiences who were increasingly skeptical of mainstream media narratives. The viral nature of her exchange with Maddow was no accident. It was the result of a new kind of political savvy, one that prioritized authenticity and directness over polish and deference. The broader implications extended beyond just media strategy. Crockett's success suggested that the expanded progressive movement was ready for leaders who weren't afraid to challenge its own institutions when those institutions became barriers to actual progress. This represented a significant shift from the traditional approach of maintaining unity at all costs. Labor unions, which had long been core constituencies of progressive politics, were watching the confrontation with particular interest. Many union leaders had grown frustrated with progressive media figures who spoke about workers' rights in abstract terms while seeming disconnected from the daily realities of their members' lives. Crockett's authentic voice resonated with union members, who felt that their concerns were often filtered through the perspectives of college-educated journalists who had never worked in factories or warehouses. Environmental justice advocates also saw parallels to their own struggles with mainstream environmentalism. Too often, they felt environmental policies were crafted by people who lived in comfortable suburbs and didn't understand how those policies might affect working-class communities of color. Crockett's challenge to Maddow represented a broader push for authentic voices to be centered in policy discussions rather than marginalized. The immigration rights community had similar reactions. Advocates who had spent years fighting for comprehensive reform often found themselves frustrated by media coverage That focused more on political strategy than on the human impact of current policies. Crockett's emphasis on lived experience over theoretical knowledge resonated with activists who dealt daily with the consequences of immigration policy on real families. Even within the feminist movement, the confrontation sparked important conversations about whose voices were elevated and whose were marginalized. Many women of color activists had long argued that mainstream feminism was dominated by white, educated women who didn't fully understand the intersectional nature of the challenges facing women from different backgrounds. Crockett's unapologetic integration of her personal beliefs with her political positions offered a model for how faith and lived experience could be part of progressive discourse without being marginalized or dismissed. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on the broader conversation about authenticity in politics. Crockett had demonstrated that real experience and genuine connection to communities could be more powerful than intellectual credentials or media savvy. In an era where voters were increasingly skeptical of political elites, her authentic voice resonated across traditional ideological boundaries. The confrontation also highlighted the generational tensions within progressive politics. Crockett represented a new breed of progressive leaders who weren't content to simply receive approval from established liberal institutions. They demanded to be heard on their own terms, with their own experiences and perspectives valued rather than filtered through the lens of media gatekeepers. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the interview had marked a turning point in progressive media. Other hosts began adjusting their approach to interviewing Democratic politicians, recognizing that the old dynamics of deference and intellectual superiority were no longer sustainable. For political junkies and casual observers alike, the Crockett-Maddow confrontation became a perfect encapsulation of the broader changes happening in American politics. It showed that authentic experience and genuine passion could still triumph over polished performance and intellectual posturing. The ripple effects extended far beyond television studios and social media platforms. Political science departments at universities across the country began incorporating the interview into their curricula, using it as a case study in how traditional power dynamics could be disrupted when participants refused to accept established hierarchies. Students who watched the confrontation often came away with a deeper understanding of how media narratives were constructed and how they could be challenged. Campaign consultants also took note of Crockett's approach, recognizing that her success offered a blueprint for how progressive politicians could engage with potentially hostile media without compromising their principles. Several consulting firms began developing training programs based on her techniques, teaching clients how to turn interview challenges into opportunities to articulate their own narratives. The legal community, particularly civil rights attorneys, saw the confrontation as validation of their own experiences with elite condescension. Many lawyers who had spent years fighting for marginalized communities while being lectured by academic experts about the proper approach to social justice felt that Crockett had given voice to their frustrations. Bar associations organized panels to discuss the intersection of legal advocacy and political representation, using the interview as a starting point for broader conversations about authenticity in public service. Religious communities also found themselves drawn into the conversation, particularly after Crockett's pointed comments about faith and lived experience. Many progressive faith leaders had long struggled with the tension between their theological commitments and the secular orthodoxy of liberal politics. Crockett's unapologetic integration of her personal beliefs with her political positions offered a model for how faith could be part of progressive discourse without being marginalized or dismissed. The confrontation even influenced international observers of American politics. Foreign journalists who covered U.S. political developments noted how the interview exemplified broader tensions within American progressivism between elite institutions and grassroots movements. Several European publications ran analyses comparing the Crockett-Maddow dynamic to similar tensions in their own political systems, where establishment parties were being challenged by more authentic voices from within their own coalitions. The story of Jasmine Crockett's devastating takedown of Rachel Maddow became more than just a viral moment. It became a symbol of a new generation of progressive leaders who refused to be silenced, dismissed, or lectured to by the very people who claimed to represent their values. In the end, Crockett had done more than just embarrass a prominent media figure. She had shown that the future of progressive politics belongs to those who live the values they preach, not just those who talk about them from positions of comfort and privilege. The reverberations from that one savage line comparing Maddow to a food critic who's never had to worry about their next meal would continue to be felt throughout progressive politics for years to come. It was a reminder that in politics, authenticity still matters more than credentials, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against intellectual arrogance is simple, unvarnished truth. Political science textbooks would eventually include the confrontation as a case study in how media dynamics could shift when traditional power structures were challenged. The interview became required viewing in journalism schools, where professors used it to illustrate both the potential and the pitfalls of confrontational interviewing techniques. The moment also marked a turning point for progressive media. More broadly, other hosts began adjusting their approaches, recognizing that the old model of intellectual intimidation was becoming less effective with a new generation of politicians who weren't intimidated by academic credentials or media platforms. The era of deferential interviews was clearly ending, replaced by a more combative style where guests came prepared to challenge their questioners as aggressively as they were being challenged themselves. For Crockett personally, the interview represented the culmination of years of preparation for exactly this kind of moment. Her background in civil rights law had taught her how to handle hostile questioning, while her experience in grassroots organizing had given her the authentic voice that resonated so powerfully with viewers. She had proven that it was possible to be both intellectually rigorous and genuinely connected to the communities that progressive politics claimed to serve. The interview also demonstrated the power of preparation combined with authenticity. Crockett hadn't just stumbled into her devastating critique of Maddow. She had clearly thought deeply about these issues and was ready to articulate her perspective. When the opportunity arose, her success showed that authentic political leadership required both genuine experience and the intellectual capacity to translate that experience into compelling political arguments. The days following the interview saw a flurry of activity in both political and media circles. Crockett's office was inundated with interview requests, invitations to speak at major events, and messages of support from across the country. Progressive organizations saw her as a new kind of leader, one who could bridge the gap between grassroots activism and the halls of power. Her social media following exploded, with thousands of new supporters eager to hear more from the Congresswoman who had dared to challenge the status quo on national television. Meanwhile, Maddow and her team were left to pick up the pieces. The network's executives held closed-door meetings to discuss the fallout, debating whether to address the confrontation directly or let the news cycle move on. Some argued that Maddow should issue a public statement acknowledging the validity of Crockett's critique and pledging to do better. Others worried that any admission of fault would only embolden critics and further damage the network's reputation. In the end, Maddow chose a middle path. Her next broadcast opened with a brief, carefully worded acknowledgement of the spirited debate and a promise to continue engaging with a diverse range of voices. But the tone was noticeably different. The confidence that had once defined her on-air persona was tempered by a new humility, a recognition that the old rules no longer applied. The impact of the interview was felt in unexpected places. In Washington, D.C., lawmakers from both parties took note of Crockett's performance. Some saw it as a warning, a sign that the days of easy interviews and softball questions were over. Others saw it as an opportunity, a chance to connect with voters by embracing a more authentic, less scripted approach to media appearances. Political consultants began advising their clients to study Crockett's technique, emphasizing the importance of preparation, authenticity, and the willingness to challenge even the most respected media figures. In the world of journalism, the confrontation sparked a much-needed conversation about the role of the media in shaping political discourse. Some journalists defended Maddow, arguing that tough questions are an essential part of holding politicians accountable. Others acknowledged that the media had, at times, become too insular, too focused on maintaining its own authority rather than truly listening to the people it claimed to serve. Editorial meetings at major news outlets were suddenly filled with discussions about how to avoid the pitfalls that had ensnared Maddow, how to balance skepticism with humility, how to challenge without condescending, how to create space for authentic voices without relinquishing journalistic rigor. For viewers, the interview was a revelation. Many had grown cynical about the endless parade of talking heads and carefully managed soundbites that defined so much of political television. Crockett's willingness to speak plainly, to challenge the assumptions of the media elite, resonated with people who felt that their own experiences had been ignored or dismissed. The flood of comments and messages that followed the broadcast made it clear Americans were hungry for something real, something honest, something that went beyond the usual partisan theatrics. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Rachel Maddow became a touchstone for a new era in American politics. It was cited in op-eds, referenced in campaign speeches, and debated in classrooms and coffee shops across the country. It became a symbol of the shifting balance of power between the media and the people they covered, a reminder that no one, no matter how respected or influential, is above being challenged. As the months passed, the lessons of that night continued to reverberate. Crockett's star continued to rise, and she used her newfound platform to advocate for the issues that had defined her career: criminal justice reform, economic equality, and the empowerment of marginalized communities. She remained unapologetically herself, refusing to be boxed in by the expectations of pundits or party leaders. Her authenticity became her greatest asset, inspiring a new generation of leaders to follow her example. Maddow, for her part, adapted to the new reality. she began inviting a wider range of guests onto her show, including activists, organizers, and everyday Americans whose voices had too often been left out of the conversation. Her interviews became more collaborative, less combative, and her audience responded positively to the change. The confrontation with Crockett had been a humbling experience, but it had also been a catalyst for growth, a chance to reimagine what political journalism could be. The end. The Crockett-Maddow interview was more than just a viral moment or a trending hashtag. It was a cultural reset, a signal that the old hierarchies of power, both in politics and media, were being challenged by a new wave of leaders who valued lived experience over credentials and truth over performance. The confrontation forced everyone, politicians, journalists, and viewers alike, to reconsider what it means to represent, to report, and to lead. For Jasmine Crockett, the experience was both vindication and motivation. She had entered the studio, determined to speak for those whose voices were too often drowned out by the noise of punditry and privilege. She left as a symbol of a movement that demanded more from its leaders and its storytellers. Her words echoed far beyond the walls of the studio, inspiring countless others to step forward, to speak up, and to refuse to be defined by someone else's narrative. For Rachel Maddow, the moment was a reckoning. It was a reminder that even the most respected voices must remain open to challenge, to growth, and to the possibility that they do not have all the answers. The humility she displayed in the aftermath, her willingness to listen, to adapt, and to invite new perspectives earned her a different kind of respect, one rooted not in authority, but in authenticity. The legacy of that night was felt in the months and years that followed. Political debates became more substantive, less performative. Media outlets began to prioritize stories from the ground up, seeking out voices that had been overlooked or ignored. The line between interviewer and interviewee, between expert and experiencer, became more porous, more dynamic, and more honest. Perhaps most importantly, the Crockett-Maddow confrontation reminded everyone watching that democracy is not a spectator sport. It is a living, breathing conversation, one that requires courage, humility, and a willingness to listen as much as to speak. The power of one savage line, delivered at just the right moment, was enough to shake the foundations of an entire industry, and to open the door to a new kind of politics, one where authenticity, empathy, and real-world experience are valued above all else. As the credits rolled on that unforgettable night, viewers across the country found themselves thinking not just about what had been said, but about what it meant for the future. The revolution in progressive politics was no longer just a slogan or a campaign promise. It was happening, live and unfiltered, in studios and living rooms and communities everywhere. And as long as there were leaders like Jasmine Crockett willing to speak truth to power, and journalists like Rachel Maddow willing to listen, the conversation and the country would be better for it.